What do you see in these frames? I see a scary entity with an evil grin from a horror movie released in 1928. What do you think people inside this film from 1928 saw when they saw this? Well, they saw comedy. They saw a disfigured freak that is nothing more than something they see in a circus. And what did this grin brought to this freak? It resulted in his life becoming a tragedy. Does this sound familiar to you?
I used to think that my life was a tragedy.
But now I realize it's a comedy.
We'll come back to this a bit later. This is Gwynplaine, a character from an American movie released in 1928 called The Man Who Laughs. The Man Who Laughs, the movie, is based on a French novel of the same name written by Victor Hugo, published in 1869. The novel The Man Who Laughs is adapted in many forms, like in plays and films. There are two adaptations on film before the 1928 movie, one in 1909 and other in 1921, both of which are now lost and are not so significant as this one is. Also, there are four adaptations in film after the 1928 film, one in a form of a French film in 1932, one in a form of an Italian film in 1966, which heavily alters the original story, and another one in 1971 in form of a TV movie, and the last one in the form of another French film in 2012, which I really want to watch but just couldn't find it. The 1928's The Man Who Laughs was directed by Paul Lenny, who was a prominent figure in German expressionist filmmaking. German expressionism in film is that one thing that deserves its own video, and it shall have it. The film stars Conrad Veidt, who was a German actor and starred in films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is one of the first silent films that I ever watched and really enjoyed. In this film, Conrad Veidt plays the role of Gwynplaine, which is our protagonist. The Man Who Laughs also stars Mary Philbin, who was an American actress in the silent era and is best known for her roles in The Man Who Laughs and The Phantom of the Opera, both of which, along with Hunchback of the Notre Dame, are the earliest and biggest Universal Horror-esque productions before the classic monsters. The film also features many prominent actors of the silent era, one of whom was Cesar Gravina, who did 75 films in his 18-year-long career, which was very common in those days. The film also stars Russian actor Olga Baklanova, who was called the Russian Tigress. I came across The Man Who Laughs probably in the last year. It was after my viewing of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, hence I was more open to watching silent films. I saw its poster, which looked creepy and attracted me. I saw its 100% Rotten Tomato score, which made me ask a question that are these old movies really that good to deserve these high scores, or they just have these scores because they are just old? Because most of them does have very high ratings, and in all the cases either there is no Rotten Tomato score for old movies or they lies above 97%. So to get the answer, I watched the film myself, and yes, they do. At least this one definitely does deserves its 100% score. And let me remind you, when I'm saying old movies here, I mean films from before 1935. When I watched The Man Who Laughs, I realized one thing that tells me why these films generally has high critic scores. That is because of several reasons. One of them is that when we think about a film from 1919 or 1928, it compels one to wonder what will the film be like, what was that era like, and that silent film tag makes one believe that it is a lesser film or an inferior film. But to be honest, after my second viewing of The Man Who Laughs, I realized actually it is a superior film compared to films today, in a way. First of all, the film does tell a story, and the absence of dialogues doesn't pose as a handicap to the story. Instead, the way the story is told by phenomenal acting and the way all the plot points and emotions are conveyed just makes you wonder that for how long you were oblivious to a great era of cinema, which I and many others still neglect, sometimes knowingly and most of the times unknowingly. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Man Who Laughs, Shiraz and A Throw of Dice made me realize that silent films are nowhere near to be called or perceived as inferior films in any way. And just a fun fact that initially when sound in film, as in synchronized dialogues, were first introduced, it was considered as just a gimmick by many critics and film advocates, and it was believed that films must not have sound. The appreciation of silent films aside, The Man Who Laughs tells a story of love with a certain amount of political commentary. The book which the film is based on got its fair share of criticism when it was first published, and over the years, after more than a century later, it is regarded as one of the best work by the author. Similarly, the film, which is in fact set in the 17th century, also had its critics, some of whom claimed that it doesn't feel like the period it is set in. And similar to the book, almost a century later, it is considered as one of the best films in cinematic history. The Man Who Laughs, his story is set in the 17th century where Gwynplaine, a son of a nobleman, is sold to a child buyer who loves to do experimental surgeries on people. This child buyer carves a permanent smile on Gwynplaine's face. Gwynplaine, who is now abandoned in this stormy and extremely cold night, finds a baby in her now dead mother's arm. He takes that baby and both of them are then taken in by Ursus, who claims to be a philosopher. Gwynplaine and that baby, who is blind and whose name is Dee, grows up and falls in love with each other. Ursus, Gwynplaine, Dee and their pet wolf Homo all performs in plays written by Ursus in fairs and carnivals from town to town. They all are happy and live with only love for each other. Then one day they all go to a new fair to perform and earn their living. There we get to see that how Dee loves Gwynplaine and Gwynplaine loves Dee. And Ursus, who now knows about this for a very long time, proposes that he would get both of them married after their work at this fair would end. And it is at this moment when we get to see the movie's one of the most emotional and powerful scenes. And also we get to know about Gwynplaine's insecurity about his grin. We see his self-respect crumbling due to the reaction of people around him, who sees him as nothing more than a freak. We see that Gwynplaine has such low confidence in himself that he doesn't even consider himself worthy of loving Dee. We also see Dee, who loves Gwynplaine from the bottom of her heart but can't understand the pain of her beloved. Only if Gwynplaine could see himself through Dee's blind eyes. After this in the movie, we are introduced to another extremely important character in the film, a duchess from the royal family named Josiana, who in almost all regards is a total opposite of Gwynplaine. Gwynplaine in terms of material doesn't have anything. Josiana is a duchess. She has a whole estate, servants and every available luxury at that time. Josiana doesn't have any friends or people who she cares about or people who cares about her. Gwynplaine has Dee, who loves him and he loves her. He also has Ursus, who is like a father to him, who cares about him and loves him too. Gwynplaine is insecure and has a lack of self-respect and confidence. Josiana is confident, loves herself and is unapologetic. Gwynplaine is free to do whatever he wants. Josiana is bound by royal customs and traditions. She has to act a certain way and she can't even choose her own husband. In the film, after the efficacious introduction of Duchess Josiana, we see that she gets aroused by the unorthodox and somewhat exotic being of Gwynplaine when she sees him at the fair and invites him to meet her. Gwynplaine, being the self-deprecating man he is, was astounded by the idea of a woman liking him, despite seeing him with her own eyes, which leads him to leave Dee alone to go to meet Duchess Josiana at her place. On reaching there, Gwynplaine finds himself in an act which can lead to sexual intercourse, where Duchess Josiana is making all the advancements. During this act, Gwynplaine finds himself to be very uncomfortable, and at the same time, Duchess Josiana receives a message from the Queen which tells her that Gwynplaine is the rightful owner of an estate currently held by Duchess Josiana, and to retain the rights over that estate, Josiana has to marry Gwynplaine. Now this message makes Duchess Josiana laugh out hard, which startles Gwynplaine and he runs back to Dee. The only woman in his life who saw him with her own eyes and still liked him laughed on him like everybody else. Now let me tell you something here. This scene is the only confusing scene in the whole film, and this scene doesn't even need or have any dialogues. When I watched this scene in my second viewing of The Man Who Laughs, I was really confused that why these two people behave the way they do. Gwynplaine, who voluntarily came to Josiana, resists to show his grin despite Josiana being kinda fine with it. And after the receiving of the message, Josiana starts laughing, which didn't make a whole lot of sense when I watched it. Gwynplaine's refusal to show his grin to Josiana can be explained by his lack of confidence and self-worth, which in fact is due to that very grin. And Josiana's laughter is a bit more interesting than what it seems to be. Josiana is an unapologetic woman in the 17th century who is bound by customs and despite being a duchess doesn't have a whole lot of freedom in her life. Hence I believe that she was not laughing at Gwynplaine but at the situations she has found herself in. A freak who she saw at the carnival which aroused her, and then when she was toying with this object of hers, she got a message stating that this object is now the rightful owner of all her assets and now she has to marry him. Josiana was already bound to marry a man in whom she doesn't seem to have any interest, laughed after reading that message. But that laughter was not the result of amusement but of self-pity and sadness. And contrary to what Gwynplaine believes, she was laughing at herself, at her own fate, her own limitations despite being a member of the elitist and most resourceful part of a society that is one of the most advanced societies of the most superior race on its planet. Whatever may be Josiana's motivation for her laughter, it didn't matter to Gwynplaine, who after being heartbroken by her laughter runs to the place where Ursus, Dee and their caravan was and finds Dee sleeping outside. Seeing this, Gwynplaine also lies down near Dee's feet and falls asleep. By the touch of her beloved, Dee wakes up and celebrates the return of Gwynplaine with him. Gwynplaine, who has now quenched his thirst of finding women who likes him even after seeing him for the first time ever, lets Dee touch his grin, and both of them rejoiced. And at this moment, Dee says, "God closed my eyes so I could only see the real Gwynplaine." With beautiful acting, by the way. After this lovely turn this story takes, many not so lovely things happen. First of all, the monarchy's people takes Gwynplaine and makes him a member of the royal house of peers forcefully. And then takes place this sequence where Ursus believes that Gwynplaine is dead, and to not upset Dee, he and all his crew acts like Gwynplaine is there and they still has a show to do. Ursus and his crew shout from the top of their lungs. They all cheer, they all hop here and there to imitate a crowd. Ursus, who believes that he has just lost a son, knows if Dee got to know that Gwynplaine is no more, he will lose a daughter too. Dee, who obviously has suspected that something is not right, plays along. But the efforts of Ursus and his crew fails when royal guards announce Gwynplaine's death in front of Dee and hand Ursus the royal order of banishment, due to which Ursus and Dee has to leave England. Here in the House of Peers, Gwynplaine is announced as a new member of the house, and Gwynplaine, who has no idea about what's going on, just plays along. And then the marriage of Gwynplaine and Josiana is announced, which finally triggers Gwynplaine, and instead of playing along, he asserts his disagreements about the marriage, which obviously causes chaos in the House of Peers. And during all this, Dee also comes very close to reaching Gwynplaine but couldn't. And then Gwynplaine says something that is heard by everybody but was needed by just two. He says that a king made him a clown, a queen made him a lord, but first of all, God made him a man. Now Gwynplaine needed to say that to assert his freedom, and only one needed to listen to it. That was Duchess Josiana, who was not at all pleased by the idea of marrying a clown. After this display of courage, Gwynplaine runs off from the House of Peers to find his family, and here comes my least favorite part of this film, an actually not so long chase sequence which obviously features a chase, some fight scenes, some dangerous looking stunts, a huge scale which is followed by a happy ending, where Gwynplaine reaches Dee and Ursus at the last moment. Gwynplaine boards the ship on which Ursus and Dee was, and he gets united with the love of his life, Dee, and the film ends with a happy ending. Now let me tell you some interesting facts here. Opposite to the film, in the book, Dee actually died when she heard the news of Gwynplaine's death, but I guess unhappy endings were not worth spending $1 million for the studio at that time. Remember Homo the wolf, who is actually played by a German shepherd named Limbo? Well, very interestingly, his name is a pun. Homo in Latin means man or human, and there is a saying in Latin, Homo homini lupus, which means a man is a wolf to another man. The chase sequence and the fight scenes are something that I very much not care about, and after my second viewing and writing of this script, I have started to crave more story from Josiana's perspective, or at least from her side. And to be honest, despite me loving this film very much and loving all the scenes between Gwynplaine and Dee, which in fact has beautiful acting, I felt very empty while watching the ending both the times. For me, the love story part of Gwynplaine and Dee's story was over when Gwynplaine came back to Dee. I believe that Josiana's story was left unfinished. The original book also had some amount of political commentary, which in fact had its critics at the time, but after watching this film twice, I can say that all the political commentary that this film has is very much insignificant to what I took away from the film. For me, the royalty and its connection to Gwynplaine was more about the disparity between the wealthy / exploiters and the common people / exploitees. For me, the commentary was social and not political. Not so similar to today, the differences between the noble / the lords and the people they will definitely outlive was phenomenally huge in that era. Josiana being a symbol of a person being controlled by the exterior, and Gwynplaine being the symbol of a person being controlled by the interior, and the whole part in the film where the exploiters try to make Gwynplaine Gwynplaine, one of their own which will lead him to be controlled by the exterior, tells that how this movie shows beautiful character dynamics with good amount of character development. Now of course, Gwynplaine, who recently won over his interior factors which pulled him back, refuses to be controlled by the exterior. But you know whose story and character development was missing from the film? Now I don't want to be that person who hangs on to what the film could have been or should have been. Hence I would like to draw your attention towards the film's one of the most important aspects, its music. Silent films, as some of you might not know, were not technically silent. By that I mean that people who went to theaters to watch The Man Who Laughs in 1928 were not sitting in a complete silent theater. In the silent era, theaters used to have their in-house pianists who played music while the film was screened, and later a monophonic music score with synchronized sound of bells and crowd murmurs was added to the film. And the current 4K restoration of the film that you will come across has a new score by Berkeley Silent Film Orchestra. I really can't imagine watching this film without that music, because first of all I'll probably sleep after 10 minutes into the film, and also if the acting is the soul of the film, then music is the heart. In the start I mentioned something about horror, tragedy and comedy. In The Man Who Laughs, Gwynplaine is a freak for the people around him. He is a clown who people laugh at. For Gwynplaine, this is a tragedy, and for the audience who is watching the film, at least visually, Gwynplaine is scary. When you take Gwynplaine out of context of the story, he looks very scary. His slick back gothic hair, his huge and scary smile, and his kinda manly stature really prevents him from being perceived as a normal clown. The movie's makeup was handled by Jack Pierce, who created Gwynplaine's look. Jack Pierce is a very famous makeup artist who is best known for creating the look of Frankenstein's monster in the 1931 The Frankenstein film, which in fact was so influential that it cemented Frankenstein's monster's look in pop culture and all the media that followed. Now I'm not aware that Gwynplaine's scary look was intentional or not, but logically I can say that it was not, because the story of the film has nothing to do with horror or scariness. On the contrary, the audience needs to root for Gwynplaine for the story to work, and because of this reason I believe that Gwynplaine's look is not like a normal clown, because it would make him funny and the audience needs to see him as their protagonist. Also, the huge smile just happened to look scary. Well intentional or not, Gwynplaine do look very scary. If you are watching the film with intertitles and following the story, then you may even forget that he looks scary. But if you see any frames with his face or clips with him even crying, you will just see a scary guy from a 1928's horror film. And the scariness of Gwynplaine is something that made it to be perceived as a horror film, and also inspired the look of DC Comics Joker. In conclusion, I would like to say that The Man Who Laughs is a good film. This movie and the movie which also stars Conrad White, the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, introduced me to the potential of silent films. I myself went into The Man Who Laughs assuming it to be a 1928's horror film. All the frames from the film and all the clips from this film prepared me to be blown away by a 1928's horror film. I was in fact blown away, but not by a horror film, but by a heartfelt, romantic, a bit tragic and extremely well acted film. I am looking forward to watching more silent films in the future and more films from Conrad White. I hope you too watch and enjoy this film, cause it is a good one.